Shalom, everyone. We're going to be getting into James chapter 3 today, so feel free to open up your Bibles to James chapter 3 when you get a chance. And while you're doing that, I'm going to open up with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav ve'etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us by his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of your Torah. So one of my all-time favorite movies, right, is based on a book series by a guy named Patrick O'Brian. The book is called Master and Commander. It's also called the Aubrey Maturin series. It's based on two men, Captain Jack Aubrey of the Royal Navy and his surgeon, Dr. Stephen Maturin. So the book and the film are based around their relationship with one another throughout the kind of later era of the Napoleonic Wars. It's, early 1800s, after Napoleon takes over in France. But the book series and the film are unimaginably accurate in their depictions of naval life at the time, as well as some of the commands that Captain Jack gives. Everything is amazingly accurate, right? In fact, it's so accurate that when I was a volunteer at the San Diego Maritime Museum, I used to work on the tall ships there, the sailing ships. I was a member of the maintenance crew, so really my job was just cleaning, which was cool by me. I was totally happy with it. But in order to study for what they call the sail crew, the group that actually goes out and sails these ships, they recommended the book series, the whole Master and Commander book series by Patrick O'Brian. Now, I should mention Patrick O'Brian died in the year 2000, so it's fairly recent, this whole series, right? So the fact that they are so accurate is unbelievable. It's just amazing. The film obviously takes some liberties from the books for the sake of the audience, which is fine. But one scene that really stood out to me in particular, right, is that early in the film, it's the first scene technically, Captain Aubrey is aboard and is the master and the commander of the HMS Surprise, a Royal Navy frigate. And they're sailing through the fog when they get shot at. They're happened upon, right? They're surprise attacked, surprise attacked by a French ship named l'Acheron, or they keep calling it the Acheron, but Acheron. So Acheron comes out of nowhere, just starts shooting, blowing stuff up, right? They're completely surprised. So Captain Jack Aubrey has to make quick decisions. So he turns the ship around, they get everybody down below on the gun decks, they start loading the guns, they're ready to go. It's this action-packed sequence. It is awesome, right? He brings Surprise about, he turns it around to give a full broadside, which is the whole side of the ship where all the guns are. And even at close range, right, he gets this amazing close range, pulls, they shoot the trigger, or they shoot the guns, and none of the shots penetrate, even at this close range, bouncing off. So they continue, they pass one another, and as they pass one another, Captain Jack is thinking, okay, we're gonna have to flip it around and do it again. And he gets called by the master, Mr. Allen, back to the taffrail, which is the rail all the way at the back of the ship. He says, Captain Aubrey to the taffrail, sir. And he runs off to the taffrail, and hanging down below it is the helmsman Bondin. And Captain Jack looks down below and he wonders what's the problem. And Bondin says, I want to make sure I get this right. He says, "The rudder's shot away. The steering won't answer, sir." Right? So then immediately after that, Mr. Allen, the master, says, "What bloody fish in a barrel?" They're terrified, right? Because now the steering won't answer and there's nowhere they can go, nothing they can do. They can't do anything. Now they're just stuck, right? Because as long as the steering don't answer, as long as the steering don't answer, sir, then they have a lot of issues, right? So this large 28-gun ship right? Over 100 officers and crew, things like 150 officers and crew, hundreds of yards of canvas sail, and thousands of years of evolving technology leading up to this, and no matter what they do, because the rudder chains have been disconnected from the rudder, they can't go anywhere. They can just keep sailing straight ahead. Now, in the film, and in the book, but in the film, Captain Jack Aubrey is able to safely outrun the Acheron, because they've done this, Acheron has to come back around and chase after. So they're able to outrun Acheron back into the fog and hide. All right, so they got to be quiet, got to be keeping everything down. But they are able to make it into the fog. But even for a moment, that hopeless feeling can't be understated, right? So James, in the book of James, the Apostle James, or Jacob, who's the author of the epistle, also references a similar idea about the power of that rudder to a ship, right? He compares it to the power of a bit or a bridle over a horse. He explains that it's similar to the tongue of the body. He shows that teachers are like the tongue of the body, right? Because they're the ones who speak. He illustrates how something so small can have these just massive consequences, right? Basically, small things have big consequences. So let's go ahead and open up to James chapter 3. Although before I get into it, I wanted to make a slight note about something that kind of cracks me up. I wanted to clarify it. I know it seems a little bit silly, but bear with me for a sec. So the Apostle James was a follower of the living Jesus, right? Not only that, he's even referenced as, quote, the brother of Christ, right? It's like literal family. So this might come as a shock to some of you, but Jesus was Jewish, very Jewish, right? His family are of the line of David. There's a bunch of prophecies specifically about him from the God of Israel, through Israel, right to the salvation of the rest of the world. So his family would travel to Jerusalem every year for the mandated feasts by God to the Jews. And so Jesus was Jewish. His whole family is Jewish. That means that his brother, James, also Jewish. Shocker, right? So James, another surprise, James is not actually a Hebrew name, right? Scholars rightly believe that James was probably actually Jacob, right? Now, why we get James is a long linguistic story that I'm actually happy to talk about at any time. So if any of you want to know, please feel free to let me know afterwards. I love talking about it. Linguistics is fun, but the name for James is actually probably Jacob, or as it would have been in Hebrew, Yaakov. But there's also some fun stuff about this, because if you know the history of the Jewish people, and you know the history of the person, Jacob, who becomes the name Israel, which is who the nation is founded after, it kind of makes a fun dynamic in the family, right? Because Jesus, Yeshua, or Joshua, Jesus, is the salvation of Israel, the people, as well as the rest of the world, right? But he comes through them. Salvation, Yehoshua, God will save his people, comes out of Israel. He's part of the Jewish people. And so Jesus is a brother to Jacob, who is the namesake of Jacob, who becomes Israel, and he's also the brother to the nation of Israel. So it's kind of a little fun side tangent there. But anyway, let's go ahead and read James chapter 3. We're going to go through the whole thing. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. What's that word, bridle? Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Verse 4, look also at ships, although they are so large and driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest fire kindles from something little. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among the members that it defiles the whole body, and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea, is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless God our Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in his similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Verse 11, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? 12, can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Number 13, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of the righteous is sown in peace by those who make peace. So point number 1, right? We see in verses 1 through 6 that the theme is clear. Small things have big consequences, and this same idea will carry through the rest of this chapter. We see the illustration of the ship's rudder and of a horse's bridle, right? The ship's rudder being so small, it can turn the whole ship. The helmsman has the power. They say a pilot's essentially the same. For the purposes of this, we'll call it the same. A helmsman has the power to steer the whole ship, right? Either into safety or into destruction. And the driver of a horse can lead himself and his horse merely by the bit and bridle, pulling on either side, towards safety or toward destruction. And likewise, the tongue can lead one into safety or destruction. As an example, consider every touchy situation you've been in with a woman that you love. When she asks you about how her new olive, drab, and red filigree pants look, your tongue, by what you say, can either direct you toward safety or toward destruction. Now, we cannot just assume that if we do nothing, everything's going to be fine, right? When a ship is sailing unmanned, what happens? The ship immediately turns all the way up, usually violently, back into the wind, directly into the wind, so that it stops its forward movement. And then this leaves it at the mercy of the current and the tide. Wherever it is, straight up into the wind, no more forward motion, wherever it gets carried by the tide or even the wind. Similarly with a horse's bridle and bit, such a small thing can make a huge difference, right? What happens to a horse if you don't steer it? Or you just let go? I'm not holding this anymore, right? It usually bucks the rider, and even if it doesn't, it'll just continue to wander around at random doing whatever it pleases, right? So what happens if a teacher doesn't do anything? If you're a teacher of the word and you don't really do anything, maybe you read the Bible, but you don't do anything, you don't teach, what happens? Congregation probably turns up into the wind and wanders around doing its own thing, right? It leads itself still to destruction. So Yaakov compares the consequences of the tongue in verse 5 to a mighty forest fire, started by like a small campfire, right? Some kindling so small. If we start a campfire and we do nothing, we don't maintain it, does it do nothing? Of course not. It either goes out or it grows out of control and consumes whole forests and lands, regardless of how hard we try. For example, I'm going to consider my homeland of Greece, which got the shirt on today, Pyrosvostikos Romaelavas, right? A forest fire started in Greece a couple of weeks ago, a number of them, right? Presumably from something small. It's not entirely known yet what it is, but there's been more than 150 individual fires that have been started in Greece, right? And firefighters from more than 20 countries have shown up constantly battling to keep it under control, and even then, they're only barely able to do so. Entire cities have been leveled, countrysides gone, and citizens of Greece have had to escape into the sea, much like they did in the 1920s, right? We can't just leave it alone. Small things have big consequences. So point number 2, right, is the hypocrisy of the tongue. Yaakov points it out. We see in verse 7, right? Verse 7, he explains that every wild animal can be tamed by man, probably a reference to the decree from God to Adam in Genesis, but that man is unable to keep his own tongue tamed, or to tame his own tongue, right, in verse 8. Then in verses 9 and 10, Yaakov says something that, I have to be honest, kind of convicted me, right? He said, we commit great hypocrisy with our tongue. In 9 and 10, with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. And he's right. It ought not to be so. To illustrate this point, Yaakov gives a couple of examples, right, of two things that don't happen naturally together. They don't happen in nature, right? We can look at verses 11 and 12. In 11, he says, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Great point. But I want to point something out here because it's helpful, right? And we have to understand these things. In the Greek, Yaakov writes, «Μητή η πηγή εκτής αυτής σιπής, βρύσει το γλυκί και του πυρκομί, δύναται, αδελφοί μου, σίκη ηλίας, ηλέης, πιαεί, η αμπέλος, σίκα ούτως, ουδέμια πηγή, αλικών και γλυκών, πήρεσε ειδών». Excuse me. So these statements, each of them, are preceded by this word, miti, or me, right? Which, it's the same, trust me, it's the same word. So this Greek word doesn't really have a great, translation into English, right? But it's a rhetorical word used in Old Greek rhetoric. And you can even see it in a lot of the Pauline epistles. He uses it constantly. But the word means that the following question can only be answered in the negative, right? There's no other option. There's no, oh yeah, that's, no. It means that it's only in the negative. So when he says, so does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter, right? In verse 11, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? The answer has to be no. Can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine figs? The answer has to be no. And so he says, thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Right? It doesn't occur naturally. And in the same way, it is just as ridiculous that a tongue that praises the Heavenly Father who made us also curses the same men who are made in the same image. As it says, the similitude, which is a great vocab word if you want to start writing those down and using them. It's fun to bring up at work. And from that comes the observation that man's tongue just cannot be tamed. The hypocrisy of the tongue is such a small thing, right? It seems like it would be so small, but as we saw in verse 6, right, the tongue is a fire of iniquity set among the members that it defiles the whole body. Those are big consequences. So even small things have big consequences. It's point number 3. The consequences of heavenly wisdom versus demonic wisdom. So what does all this mean, right? As teachers, and even as Christians, we cannot leave the body alone because they may wander off and do as they please, right? Or they'll die out. And it will inevitably lead to destruction. We also cannot lead them wrongly, right? Or they, at our direction, will be led to destruction. We instead have to lead them on the right way, which is back to God. Just as every prophet of Israel had done prior to us, just as all the apostles, just as Jesus attempted to do and was successful. We have to lead people back to God. That's the point of the teacher. So how do we know which is the right way, right? Yaakov helps us by illustrating two opposite ends of the spectrum of wisdom. Right? In verse 13, he says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom, right? Good conduct and good works. And in the meekness of wisdom. So think of someone that you know, right? Who has good conduct and good works and has done those things in the meekness of wisdom. Yaakov says that those people have wisdom and understanding, and good wisdom and understanding. This is parallel to verses 17 and 18, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. So as we watch our own teachers, we can look for those things, and those things are a clear and obvious sign of someone who has heavenly wisdom from above. We can do the same thing, right? As we look out to our own teachers, we can see, oh yeah, there's good and heavenly wisdom. Or we can ask people that we know closely and who we know will be honest with us to be honest with us about our own fruits, and to tell us, yeah, those are, that's great. You're doing that exactly right. That's spot on, right? That's heavenly wisdom from above. Or to say, no, that's not heavenly wisdom from above. It's something else. What is the something else? So Yaakov demonstrates in verses 14 through 16, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. That's some pretty intense language, right? So Yaakov shows that the fruits of those with demonic wisdom have bitter envy, right? They're self-seeking, they boast, they lie against the truth. He says that this kind of wisdom is not from above, but rather it's from the earth, or more like those who are in the earth, right? And especially the one who has power in the earth. Yaakov calls it demonic, and rightly so. He further shows that the fruits of this kind of wisdom produces envy and selfishness and confusion and every evil thing. Those are some pretty harsh words. So if we as teachers, or if we as Christians, or even teachers, chas v'chalila, are simply envious or selfish, these are fruits of demonic wisdom that doesn't come from above. And the feelings can be so small and slight, but they mean something huge, right? Because small things have big consequences. So now we know that even though the tongue is small, it can have major, even catastrophic consequences. Like the rudder of a ship or a horse's bridle, right? The untamed tongue can lead the whole body to safety or to destruction. But worse than that, just like the rudder or the bridle, or like a small fire left unmaintained, doing nothing will undoubtedly lead to destruction too. So it seems like the path is narrow. So how do we as teachers, and even as Christians, avoid leading congregations or others wrongly? When someone comes to us and they need us, how do we avoid leading them wrong? We can see the fruits of the heavenly wisdom are good works, conduct done in wisdom and humility, whereas the fruits of demonic wisdom are self-serving, right, and untruthful. Pretty straightforward. So it is up to us then to be humble and to conduct ourselves well, to do good works. Frankly, we owe it to our congregations because every small thing has big consequences. How do we avoid leading them to destruction? Remember back to the story that I told about one of my favorite movies? Captain Aubrey had the rudder chain destroyed, right? It had been destroyed and he saw that. So he couldn't use it, but he had to do something. He couldn't do nothing, but he's familiar with it. He did something he was very familiar with. He navigated. So how do sailors avoid running aground or hitting other boats or hitting other things? How do they keep themselves, their vessel, their crew, and their cargo safe? They absolutely do not steer the ship wherever the wind does and try to do whatever they want, whenever they want, right? That would be no different from doing nothing. No, when sailors need to ensure the safety of themselves, the vessel, the crew, the cargo, they carefully plot a course by thinking ahead, right? They look at maps and charts. They know what the tide is going to be and how the circulation of the earth or the moon around the earth affects those things. He's observant and sensitive to his surroundings, of what is marked ahead of him, and he always has a plan. In other words, he conducts himself well and takes seriously the threats that are out there. If the tongue is a rudder and the congregation is the ship, then we must plan ahead. We must navigate well and conduct ourselves accordingly to avoid danger. If we're to make peace, if we're humble and good, then we sow righteousness. Right? How much peace do we need to make? How much righteousness do we need to sow? It's easy. Start with a little, because even small things have big consequences. Shalom, everybody.